The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Leon Charney report, and it's an extraordinary report. First time in our history, and we've been on the air close to 15 years, we are going to do a two-part series about a very, very important, possible catastrophe in this world. And it's called nuclear terrorism, it's called terrorism, it's called fundamentalism. And there's a great man, a very well-known man named Graham Allison, who is a former dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, served everybody, pretty close, I think, to John Kerry, but I don't think it's political. I think he just really wants to get the world together, and if it was George Bush, it'd be the same. We're going to spend 2 hours talking about his book, and it's called Nuclear Terrorism, the Ultimate Preventable Catastrophe. Why did I do this? Well, I've been up here following the convention, and I've been to many conventions. I've delegated and been in caucuses, etc. But the truth is that since September 11th, you may not have conventions again if we don't stop these nuclear catastrophes and fundamentalisms. So I thought, rather than run around with a camera and talk to every delegate who has an idea about hog farms and subsidies, we need to talk really about the world. Now, I went over to Harvard, and I attended 2 sessions at the John F. Kennedy School. One was chaired by David Gergen, but you can always find him on television, so we don't find Graham all the time. We want to get him on television. And the other was by Larry Summers, who was the president of Harvard. He chaired an economic conference the day before. So instead of eating hot dogs on the floor, we thought we'd get really very serious. So Graham, first of all, welcome to the show. I mean, it's our pleasure to have you. But I think what you are doing is the most important thing in the world today, because if you don't do it and put this in a position where we can cure it, we don't have a world.
Well, Leon, I appreciate your inviting me on, and I'm honored to be here. I've been an admirer of your show, so I'm especially proud to have a chance. And I agree with you that this, the topic of nuclear terrorism is a pretty dismal.
Right.
But actually, my book is kind of a bad news, good news book.
The nice thing about you is you look cheerful, though.
Well, I'm a congenital optimist. But I think in the case of nuclear terrorism, while I believe it is a urgent problem for us today, the good news message of this book is that this is the ultimate preventable catastrophe.
Yeah, that's what, I just took on to that in a minute. Because you talk to everybody, and they say, well, the attack is going to come. The 9/11 attack is going to come. You talk to the congressman or Tom Kaine, it's going to come. We don't know when it's going to come, but it's going to come. Even at your symposium that you had at Harvard the other day, well, it's going to come, you know. And what attracted me to you is, well, there is somebody sort of with an answer. You know, you're sort of the Messiah to me.
Well, I don't want to go that far, but I think the proposition, what most people have not grasped is that we're not able to prevent all forms of terrorism. That's not going to happen. We're not going to even prevent other major attacks on America. That's going to happen. But what we can do is prevent what President Bush calls the most destructive technology in the world, that's nuclear, being used by the most dangerous people, terrorists. And as I try to argue in the book, and I think it's persuasive, this is a finite challenge which is subject to a finite response. That is, there's a finite list of actions that if we took them, unfortunately many of which we're not taking today, but if we took them, would reduce the likelihood of nuclear terrorism to almost zero.
All right, let me hold you for 1 minute. You served in how many administrations?
Well, I had the good fortune to serve on the Defense Policy Board for every Defense Policy Board and every Secretary of Defense since Caspar Weinberger. So that was in the Reagan period.
Right.
And actually, I worked for Weinberger for 2 years in the Reagan administration, happily. And so all through the rest of Secretaries of Defense until I joined the Clinton administration in the first term in 1993.
All right,
Yeah.
and always in this area.
Yes.
Did you have any inclination that there could be a 9/11?
Yes, indeed.
You did?
Yes, indeed. As did anybody who studied this subject carefully before 9/11. I think if you look at the 9/11 Commission report, there were a group of people, mostly people who had looked at it carefully, including CIA in this instance. As the 9/11 Commission report says, in the summer of 2001, George Tenet was going around with his hair on fire. So he was telling anybody who could, wait a minute, all the signs are that Al-Qaeda is going to attack us in some big way here at home. So when I was in the Defense Department, now this is back in 1994, wrote a memo, a classified memo, but which became the subject of some controversy, in which I wrote something called, it was called 100 Horribles. And it was called the hierarchy of horribles, in which a airplane attack on a building like the Capitol or other buildings like the World Trade Center.
You wrote that?
Was about a third of the way from the bottom, and there were many, many, many more horrible things than that, including at the top of it, nuclear terrorist attacks. So this is not a new problem for us. It's just that 9/11 should sort of, provide that flash of lightning that lets us all look and
All
see.
right, so where were you at 9/11?
On 9/11, this is a funny story. My wife was supposed to be on American 11 going to Los Angeles that day, but thank God, to a board meeting in Los Angeles. But the weekend, the board meeting was postponed for a day. So she was on she had been on the Tuesday flight, and she switched her reservation to the Wednesday flight. Tuesday morning, I was on the telephone call of a board that I'm on, in which, while the call was going on, I got a call from someone in government that said, "Oh my God, what you've been thinking about, what appears to have happened."
And what was your visceral feeling?
Well, I turned on the television to watch this
this
horror, but
I knew it was going to happen.
Internally,
guts?
Internally, I thought, "Oh my God, what we've been worrying about happening has now happened." And with the first plane, it wasn't clear. I mean, when the call came to me, it was from somebody who said that's what they thought had happened, but it was unclear. When the second plane, then it was absolutely clear. And Rich Armitage, who's the Deputy Secretary of Defense, had the same reaction. He said, when the second plane hit, I've talked to him about this, he said, he knew exactly what was going on. Dick Clark, if you look at his book, also quite clear.
Just go with, do you know Clark? To him, not to me. Go.
Graham, do you know Dick Clark?
Yes, I know him well. He's an outstanding public servant. He spent 30 years working in the national security establishment. He's a solid person. He's a very unusual bureaucrat because he's a bulldog. When he gets hold of an issue, he's not always diplomatic or bureaucratic. So if he's in your face, okay? And so some people don't like him in that regard. But on terrorism, early on, he focused on the issue and has been right on target. He was Bush's head of counterintelligence and fighting terrorism before 9/11. And as he says in this book, all his efforts to warn the Bush administration about Al-Qaeda and the risk of terrorism were not taken seriously. And I think if you look at the record in the 9/11 Commission report, while they don't jump to the conclusion, they provide all the evidence to support Clark's proposition.
But tell me, Graham, the 9/11 report, and I haven't read it fully, it says that 4 times Bill Clinton could have taken Al-Qaeda out, 6 times Bush. You were with the Clintons. What was going on?
I believe that the Clinton administration failed and the Bush administration failed to take Al-Qaeda seriously and to act on this before 9/11. Now, fortunately, after 9/11, but it's a hell of a price to pay.
That's right.
Yeah, a hell of a price to pay. We took down al-Qaeda's training camps. But until that point, under Clinton and under Bush, al-Qaeda was running camps in Afghanistan, bringing thousands of young men from all over the world to learn to do things like 9/11. And we were sitting there saying, well, there's this shield of sovereignty, you know, they're a country, they do what they want to within their own country. When we had chances to grab bin Laden, 2 or 3, CIA gave, well, first the administration was not saying, yes, do that now and don't tell me why you can't, but also CIA was kind of lame. It turns out that, as we now learn from the 9/11 Commission report, if you didn't know it before, there's a lot of just documented evidence, the capabilities of CIA in covert action have atrophied. So this is now a weak reed, maybe non-existent. So can a great country be without a capacity for covert action? Not at all. Mm-hmm. And even our spies were, the network that we used to have in the Cold War in the Soviet Union, as you're familiar with, of spies, in countries like Afghanistan or in the Middle East, we obviously don't have. Again, 9/11 Commission factoid. And going into 2000, not a single CIA agent had ever laid eyes on, with their own eyes, on bin Laden in Afghanistan. Well, excuse me, you know, John Lynn or whoever this crazy American was, you know, went there and signed up and got there. I mean, so what was going on? The answer was, this is a pathetic response before, because we just didn't wake up. Now, 9/11 Commission, I think, is too gentle on both Bush and on Clinton, too gentle, in my view, in saying, well, there was a failure of imagination. I think it was a failure of some people's imaginations, but it wasn't a failure of Clancy's imagination to imagine an airplane crashing into the Capitol. That was a bestseller in 1994. Right, so, you know, Condi Rice said at the 9/11 hearings, no one could have imagined people taking over an airplane and crashing it into a building. Excuse me. I think a few million people read this novel quite plausibly. Al-Qaeda had hijacked an airplane and tried to crash it into the Eiffel Tower earlier. Did we know about that? Of course we knew about that. Al-Qaeda had looked at the question of crashing an airplane into CIA. Did we know about that? Of course we knew about this. So the proposition that we didn't know is, I think, rather pale. I think the proposition we didn't take it seriously. We didn't focus on it. So part of, I think, what we need to do now is, if 9/11 only awakes us to airplanes and not to other things that could be done, right? How about boats? And how about nuclear terrorists? So it seems to me that if somebody tries after the first nuclear terrorist attack, they have another 9/11 Commission report, and it goes through this, and the person says, well, you know, nobody knew about nuclear terrorism. We only knew they could crash airplanes in the buildings. You would say, that's pathetic.
What bothers me is you were on top of this thing from Weinberger on. Weinberger was secretary in 1980, and you were writing memos. Who was getting these memos?
Well, now, I wasn't writing about terrorism then. Then we were trying to defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War.
All right.
And
in a way,
to Reagan's credit, that was a lot easier.
That was a lot easier.
A lot more focused. Right. And there was a great bipartisan effort by Republicans and Democrats for 4 decades, but it led to victory.
But when did you start writing about terrorism?
I became interested in terrorism intensely in the late 1980s, when the Soviet Union started to unravel.
You were one of the first people really involved with terrorism.
Well, I was one of the people, though there's quite a lot of people who, I mean, if you look at it, there's a community of people who've studied terrorism.
Right.
Not big enough. Now, a number of them for a long time thought terrorists only wanted sympathy, therefore they would never do something big. So they were doing, you know, onesies and twosies, not big events. I always disagreed with that. But once you saw Shinrikyo, which was a crazy religious sect in Japan that tried to kill the whole Japanese government with sarin, with bio, okay? And then you saw Yosef. This is the Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist who blew up the World Trade Center. We forget. Most people don't know that in 1993,
I don't
this
forget.
guy,
I had a,
no, I know you don't.
No, I had a meeting with Governor Cuomo at the World Trade Center that day.
That day?
And
Oh,
I was
my
in
God.
Florida, and I was into a swimming contest, and I said to the governor, you know, I think I'm going to miss this. And he said, all right, go swim. And I missed it. I was there to be there at 11 o'clock.
Wow.
So I know that feeling.
And when Yosef, who's in the Supermax prison in Colorado, so you can go talk to him, okay, what was he trying to do? He thought he was going to fell one tower into the other and kill 40,000 people. That was his objective. So by 1993, this is no longer hypothetical. These are guys that are trying to kill us. And then people who were tracking al-Qaeda at CIA and Clark at the counterterrorism effort in the White House were saying these guys are the guys they're training, they're planning, they're exercising. We think that they're going to do something. So this was something which people kind of turned a blind eye to rather than they didn't have any more.
All right, Graham, here's my problem. I used to think that terrorism was caused by people who are not fed well, who are poor, who are disinvolved, etc. You take a guy like Osama bin Laden who has wealth.
Right.
So basically, he's out for power. He's corrupting and manipulating these people. So the typical formula, which I thought years ago, is poor people who are disenchanted, it doesn't really work that way. This is a fundamental question of people wanting to change this world. Am I correct or incorrect?
I agree with you, and I think that the picture of terrorism is that in most Americans' minds, and certainly the way President Bush talks about it, is wildly oversimplified.
Yeah.
And in fact, again, to commend the 9/11 Commission report, they have a pretty sophisticated discussion of it that says, you know, that this idea that it's terrorism is which is a tactic as the target, as opposed to terrorists who are people who are killing us for some reason, confuses
Strategically,
people.
right.
Yeah, strategically confuses people.
Right.
So who are these people that want to kill us, and why do they want to do it? Now, there was a traditional view, as you say, that, well, it's because they're poor and disenfranchised, and so that's what this is
Doesn't
about.
work.
No, historically, actually.
By the way, you know where I found that out? In suicidal bombings in Israel.
Oh, exactly.
Women with children, lawyers, professional,
Right.
not poor, willing to give their lives away.
Right.
This is fundamental.
Absolutely. Now, if we look at it as a historian, actually, I mean, we don't like to say so, but there's been lots of terrorism historically, and oftentimes, in fact, the most common form has been for a national population which is occupied by somebody else
Correct.
to use terrorists to drive the occupiers out.
Right.
The Indians blew up the parliament and the hotels.
Menachem Begin
with
blew up the King David Hotel.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the Stern Gang were absolutely, they were engaged in what we would now call terrorist activities.
And they call them freedom fighters.
And we call them, and Ronald Reagan actually had a good line on this. He said, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Right.
Now, so the tactic of terrorism, which is blowing up or killing innocent civilians for political objectives, is not a new story. We
That's
know about
correct.
this in lots of places. Bin Laden, if you read what he says, and I read very carefully because I find him fascinating, he's got a crazy, I think an evil, but in the same way that Hitler was a deranged, evil, rational nut. And if you read Mein Kampf, as Churchill did, you would say, my God, this person is trying to destroy our civilization. That's what he concluded. Now, most people say, oh, well, Hitler, you know, he's a misunderstood nationalist.
No way.
Give him a little land in Czechoslovakia, he's going to be happy.
No.
You know, there's this stuff about Jews. It's just for building up political support. No, Hitler meant what he said, and he wrote it out. And Bin Laden, if you read what he says, he's got a theory of the case, which is pretty interesting, which mostly, and again, I think the Bush administration has misled people about this because it says these people only want to kill. We don't need to look into their motives because it's their fault, not our fault, to which I would say a strategic analysis has got to ask, not how can we agree with these people, but how can we understand what's motivating them in order to undermine that motivation and, if necessary, arrest them, and if necessary, kill them. But the idea that we're going to successfully, without understanding where this is coming from, kill and lock up all of them, we're not going to do it. So now, what does he want?
Bin Laden?
Bin Laden.
He
What
wants
does he
to
want?
change the world.
Well, first he wants American troops out of Saudi Arabia. That's been his first thing on his list for now 6 years. Now, most people don't understand this and don't know this. When did the last American soldier occupying Saudi Arabia leave the kingdom? And the answer is on the second anniversary of 9/11. So our military basing there is gone. We didn't announce it. We didn't say very much about it. We say that it has nothing to do with the war on terrorism. We just repositioned. Okay, it's a little bit like Israel coming out of Lebanon. Israel said, it didn't have anything to do with Hezbollah blowing us up and killing us from time to time, to which the answer is mostly occupiers in general, when the prices come too high, have decided, they've at least asked themselves, is there some other way to deal with the things that are vital to me? Now, is Israel going to give up Israel because of suicide bombers from Palestine? No. But did Israel, an Israeli government, Barak, conclude that occupying land in Lebanon was a bad idea, and was that affected by the cost for Israel? Again, as an analyst, I have to say, of course it was. I can't not have been.
The people wanted to get out.
Right.
That was it.
Right.
It
And now,
choice.
so one, he's trying to get us out of Saudi Arabia, which he calls the land of the two holy sites. So the idea of American troops around Mecca and his country just drove him crazy. Secondly, he wants Americans out of Islamic lands. If you look at this audio tape that he released just a couple of weeks ago, he said to Poland and Bulgaria, let's make it plain, as long as your troops are occupying our territory, it's our intent to have bombs go off in your territory. So you look and think, wait a minute. So he's trying to intimidate these countries by getting them out in terms of his plan. So he wants them out of the Muslim Arab lands, and he calls us crusaders, which again, think of Muslim history. Actually, there were a whole bunch of crazy Europeans who went off on crusades, going into countries, occupying and whatever. And then he sees this as colonialism. And that's part of, again, you try to understand it through his eyes. Now then he gets megalomaniacal, from my view, and he imagines some kind of great Islamic caliphate which would go through the whole Muslim areas, and then maybe he even has grander aspirations. So I think this is an evil man. I think he has an evil design. I think he hates us for understandable reasons. This is not implausible. And I think for him and his movement, we need to take down people who are training to do things like 9/11 to us. But I think we have to understand what is the roots of this, where is this coming from, and how can we address those items.
All right, we're going to get into it. We're going to take a break. We'll come right back with Graham Allison. As I said before, this is probably the most important conversation we've ever had on this show, because unless we get to the root of what is causing terrorism and nuclear terrorism and fundamentalism, it's hard to know who's going to survive in this world, and it does not matter. We're at the convention site, whether George Bush is president or John Kerry. It will not matter. So we'll be right back.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high. To have this courageous man and my close friend killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Now get the book the hit movie was based on, Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels. Learn about the backdoor channel negotiations that led to the historic 1978 Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Become a witness to history and order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Also available at all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at iTunes or Audible.com. Relive history. Order Backdoor Channels. Get best-selling author Leon Charney's latest book, The Battle of the Two Talmuds. Join Charney as he explores years of Jewish history to find out why and how Talmudic scholars and rabbis abandoned the Holy Land for the lands of the diaspora. Learn about the power struggles behind the creation of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. It's a book critics call engaging and enlightening, a book which will be of interest to people of every faith. Now available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or download the audiobook of The Battle of the Two Talmuds at iTunes or Audible.com. Leon Charney sets out to discover the true meaning of the Kaddish, the Jewish custom of reciting a prayer to commemorate the death of a close relative. Join Charney as he finds out the history of the Kaddish and how it has evolved. Reviewed as a refreshing walk through Jewish history and a book that deserves to be read by both Jews and non-Jews, The Mystery of the Kaddish is now available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at Audible.com or on iTunes. Discover The Mystery of the Kaddish. Available now over iTunes, Amazon, and Google Play. Leon Charney's cantorial CD in Disco Lam. Listen as Charney movingly sings El Mole Rachamim and Charney's amazing rendition of a disco remix of Adon Olam, all sung in the incredible and individual Charney style. Also listen to the CDs on Rhapsody. Download Leon Charney's cantorial songs in Disco Lam, the disco remix of Adon Olam on Amazon, iTunes, and Google Play. Or listen in on Rhapsody. All available now.
We're back. I'm Leon Charney, and I have the pleasure of talking with Graham Allison, who's the founder of the Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, which is probably the best school of government in the world. There's a place called Harvard, in case you didn't know it, in this town. And everybody walks around. You know, they make more money on their T-shirts. They must license that name. Wherever you go, it's all Harvard.
I think some of them may be knockoffs, yeah.
Graham, can intellectual guys transform themselves into real doers? You guys, I don't mean you because you've been in the government, but that's a theoretical question. I can sit there or someone can sit there and write a book and say theoretically this should happen, but then you got to get into the action. How does one transform from that? You have done it.
Well, it's a very good question. I think George Bernard Shaw once said, those who can do and those who can't teach. Right. About what those who can. So there's a danger. And there's a Yogi Berra line that I'm very partial to. He says, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. But in practice, there is. Okay? So the question
Well, I'll tell you why I ask. Yeah. I was very involved with Jimmy Carter and Camp David. Carter had three rows to him. One was Brzezinski, National Security Council. The other guy was Cy Vance, who was Secretary of State. Right. The other was myself and Bob Lifshitz, who had this direct ear to the president. And I had no academic background in politics. I'd served in the Senate with Vance Hartke, but I wasn't teaching at Harvard. I was out lawyering and doing my thing. And yet, at the end of the day, most of my suggestions were more practical and were accepted. And there was always this fight. Well, you know the White House. The key to the White House is access. Whoever has access to the president, he wins. So you would have Brzezinski fighting with Vance to get in there, and all of a sudden Charney is schlepping in there, 456, 1414, and the president saying, let's hear what Leon says. And the academics, they were rough, because if I would give a memo to the president, the academic would want to change it, put his little value on it.
Put a memo on top, yeah.
Memo on top. So from that point of view, you got to give Jimmy Carter a lot of credit. And my question always was, how do these academics transform? And you seem to have done that very well.
Well, I think there's a long history of this, and in which some are more successful than others. I would say Henry Kissinger, when he went to Washington, was my professor when I was at Harvard.
How was he as a professor?
Well, he was a great professor. And
you stay in touch with him?
I do, regularly. And in fact, when he went to Washington, he asked me to come with him, but I stayed and began building what became ultimately the Kennedy School.
I see.
But in any case, I've stayed, watched. Now, when Henry went to Washington, the well-known fact at Harvard was that he wouldn't last a year, just because of what people knew about him. I think he turned out to be maybe the most successful academic ever in such a world.
Right.
If you look at Brzezinski, is another interesting example. Spig also looked somewhat implausible, but I think did a great job. Larry Summers, you mentioned earlier, the president of Harvard.
Right.
I mean, Larry was a brilliant young economist. He won a prize for, the smartest economist under 40. People said when he went to Washington, this is fated to be a short, because Larry doesn't suffer fools, he's not the most diplomatic. He became a great under deputy and then Secretary of the Treasury. So there's some people who make that transition reasonably well. I think the difficulty for academics is that they think of the world in terms of straight lines.
Yes.
But most of the world consists in
Gray
rather
areas.
crooked,
Right.
complicated things. And so getting from an abstraction to the practicalities. Plus the other thing, and I find this in my own life very much, it's fun to think of a solution to the problem, and you work that out. That's about 5% of the
Then comes the execution.
way of getting there. And the execution, which involves lots of hand-to-hand combat, as you know from the White House or in any such setting, plus dealing with obstacles, plus getting recalcitrant bums to either be persuaded, or if they can't be persuaded, be coerced. It's a whole nother. That's a kind of a different game for many people. But I think what the practitioners often miss is if you don't have the picture of where you're trying to go, and you don't have the issue rightly identified, sometimes the most efficient bureaucratic operator is just going off in the wrong direction, and they may be fantastically effective at that. But I tell people, if you're going faster down the road in the wrong direction, you're only getting further away. So I think you need, in fact, I would say there's more mistakes made in the U.S. government and other governments by failure to get a proper understanding of the challenge and a strategy for dealing with it than there are with screwing up in the process of not doing it.
Graham, it's also Freudian. There's a lot of egos involved, and we're all part of the ego society.
Absolutely.
And in order to maneuver your way in Washington, and I've done it for 10, 12 years, and you've done it, it is not simple. The question is, what do we lose from it? What do we lose because the clerk couldn't get his message across? What do we lose if someone didn't touch your memo at one time when he should have touched it? What happens? And these things become very serious now because of what you say, because we could be really terrorized and nuclearized.
Well, the reason in our system, as you suggested already, that this is a presidential system of government.
Right.
Now, the president is not all-knowing, as any president would. I mean, John Kennedy was very clear about this. Harry Truman was maybe the best. He would always say, there's a million people who could do this job better than I can, but I'm here and I'm going to do my best. Right. But he thought that his Secretary of State was even more knowledgeable than he was, and he was, about the world. George Marshall, surprise. So it's a presidential system of government in which the president has got to say, this matters more.
Prioritize.
And this matters less. Right. And that's very tough because there's thousands of things coming to him. So people say, well, gee, the most important thing is to do this. Now, you were saying earlier, yes, it's important, the jobs program. Yes, it's important, the health problem. Yes, it's important, AIDS. Yes, it's important, poverty in Africa. Yes, it's important what's happening in Lebanon. Yes, it's important what's happening in Sudan. So, how many thousands of things are there crashing down upon an American government? A president's got to say, let me ask, what matters most to Americans' lives and liberties? And start there, and then say, how can I address that problem? And I think if you ask that question, you would say, what's the most horrible thing, what's the only really existential threat to American civilization as we know it?
Nuclear terrorism.
On that list, I would say it's a nuclear terrorist attack on cities like New York, Washington, and Boston, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Now, how could that actually happen? Unfortunately, a lot easier than most people appreciate. What would the consequences be? Catastrophic. And then, as I say, I'm not a doom and gloom person. Is this preventable? Yes. By doing what? I try to give a list in the book. Well, then how come we're not doing that? Well, that's befuddling. And I think it's just The reason why, therefore, a president has got to say, this is an absolute priority for Americans. My government and everyone in it is going to do everything technically feasible on the fastest possible timetable to prevent nuclear terrorism. And if there's some reason why you're not doing it, you come back and tell me why. Because if you can't do it, get off the pot. Somebody else can have a chance.
Right. Well, you know John Kerry, right?
Yes.
And Kerry has seen your book?
He's certainly seen the ideas in it. I gave him a copy of an earlier draft, but he actually has thought about this problem himself for some time. So we've had a conversation.
Do you know him a long time?
Yes, he's the junior senator here in Massachusetts. I've had him come to the center and make presentations. I mean, Kerry began to get this problem when he did an investigation in the mid-90s of BCCI. This was some bank scandal.
Yeah, sure.
And he became to be interested in it. I don't remember exactly why, but he did an investigation and held hearings and discovered the underbelly of globalization, what I call it. Namely, that what globalization, for all of its wonders, it creates global networks of communication, transportation, money, finance, in which terrorists, money laundering, all that's just, they use the same superhighways.
BCI, by the way, let me remind the audience, was the bank that Clark Clifford, who used to be in the government, was very involved with.
Oh, that's right.
And they were sort of laundering money. And what Graham is saying is absolutely correct. When you get globalization, it means you get wires from Colombia going to Afghanistan. And it may sound great, and you may have a great global village, but what it does is set up situations where terrorists can really take hold of money. And money is always one of the fundamental aspects of what we're talking about. But in any case, let's go on.
So what Kerry did, just if I could finish 1 second, is he himself, as he explained this to me at one time. I thought I couldn't see what was interesting about BCCI. I mean, it was interesting. I read about it in the paper.
Oh,
he said, well, really, once you sort of start understanding it, you see that the very same things that allow financial markets now to move $1 trillion in currency exchange every day can be used by somebody to send, like from Saudi Arabia, a person, money to a terrorist in Los Angeles or Boston, and it just, there it goes, okay? The same thing, the transportation, that makes it wonderful that you and I can get on a plane and go to London or to Frankfurt. That same plane somebody else can get on and, come here. The transportation that right now, if you go shopping in any store and you buy a shirt, where did that shirt come from?
Hong Kong.
It came from China. Okay,
China.
And Walmart's is in effect the kind of the distribution center for world production in China and other places. Well, how does all that stuff get here? By all those sea-land containers, those cargo containers that come on ships every day.
Correct.
Thousands of them come to our ports every day. What percentage of those do we open to see what's inside? Less than 5%. So in those, as Kerry pointed out, you can ship everything. So he wrote a book called The New War back in '96 or something like that, in which he says that we need to wake up to the fact that globalization is empowering non-states, people, to do bad things as well as good things. And those bad things include BCCI type things, money laundering, drugs, and terrorism. And he even gets to, is a little discussion of nuclear terrorism, even this now, then. So I think he feels this.
That's pretty good. I mean, I don't think a lot of people know that he really had an intellectual
Well, the book was not a big seller.
I should say that?
Yeah.
He didn't do the Charney report, Graham.
Too bad for him, because the book was not a big seller, though it's worth reading now. I recommend
am very
it to
impressed.
people.
I don't know about the book, and I'm highly impressed by it. And I think it shows a great intellectual capacity for Kerry, which maybe a lot of people don't know about.
I think people will get to know Kerry better. I've known him for 20 years, just since he's here in Boston, had dinner at his house, and had dinner out at restaurants and so forth. Kerry is a thoughtful person who gets an issue and just sort of thinks about and works on it. He's been thinking about a whole bunch of issues like this for a long time, trying to do his job as a senator. And when he gets a problem that he doesn't know the answer to or where he's working on it, he reads, he talks to people. He likes to talk to people who disagree with him. You know, he'll say, here's my view, what do you think about that? You say, well, I don't agree with that. He says, well, why not? You know, you listen, well, okay, maybe. So I think he's a thoughtful person, and because the problems that we deal with are that the country faces are complex problems, I think being thoughtful is good. Now, he doesn't always come across as, you know, with a few snappy lines, and I think
he's
that's
not charismatic. He won't be killed for that. But what I get from you, though, Graham, is if George Bush called you and said, you know what, this is a terrible problem, I'd like you to handle it, you would go work with George Bush?
in a heartbeat.
And if John Kerry did the same, you would do the same. You're an American, you want to save America. To you, it's not politics. This is survival.
Not about politics. And in fact, before I wrote this book, which I only, you know, just have done in the past year, in the last 2 years, I've made my best efforts with colleagues and friends in the Bush administration. I mean, Condi Rice, I know for when I tried to hire her as an assistant professor unsuccessfully. Stanford beat me out. Yes, she's a terrific person. Steve Hadley, her deputy, I've worked with he was an assistant secretary of defense a long time ago. So I've been pressing this case with colleagues.
What does Condi say when you talk to her?
She says, well, we agree, we're working on it, we're trying, but I think what I say to her, and what I have said to her, is when I look at the test is the performance. I mean, I look and see the bottom lines with respect to things that make us safer or more at risk of nuclear terrorism, and I would say on that, I have to give the administration poor grades.
Is that right? But you are Harvard, or you and your group. You're probably the best group in the world who studies this, at least in the United States. I don't know, maybe they're doing it in Oxford. You would think they'd be calling you a lot to find out. I mean, it's not hard to get. It is hard to get a lot of great experts on this who really study this. So, you know, Condi can call you, and she knows you, and Hadley and all these guys. I would think they'd be calling you a lot. You know, this is the world. What I don't understand, and since my Jimmy Carter days, is how do these politics get involved with really the survival and the statesmanship, and it gets me crazy. It really does. I mean, I have no axe to grind, but if I had a source like you or Harvard, who really, I'm sure you have other people under you who study this, I mean, I'd be on the phone with you every hour. I mean, this is not a game.
Well, we have an excellent team at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, which I'm the director of. John Holdren, who's a distinguished physicist, Matt Bunn and Tony Weir, who've written this excellent report card. So we have a team of people.
Yeah.
I would regard this as the most important challenge to America, and
Absolutely.
so as director of the center, I've, focused our resources on this topic, and I count myself privileged to have a chance to offer my 2 cents worth to these folks. I would say in politics may be a little bit of it, but I think the bigger part is anybody in government, just as you said earlier, overwhelmed by so many different issues.
But Graham, it's another world since 9/11.
It is.
Poverty could be a problem, Social Security, Medicare, anything you want. But this is the world. We don't have an umbrella. Then you don't have the problem of poverty.
Well, I thought what happened on 9/11 should wake up any reasonable American to the fact that we're in the midst, as the president says, a war on terrorism for the long run against people who really want to kill us. Now, initially there was a good start. Then, for whatever reasons, and I think I've got my views about it, but for whatever reasons, we went off to Iraq. Iraq has been consuming of the whole national security community. As a friend of mine who's in the system says, it sort of sucked all the air out of everything else. Where I urged them to go was from war on terrorism to war on nuclear terrorism. If President Bush had said, if we had wrapped up bin Laden and and al-Zawahiri, his number two, who's really maybe as mischievous as bin Laden, because he's a very organized guy, this Egyptian physician.
Right.
If we had caught them and captured them and finished taking down al-Qaeda, which we were about to do before we took those resources, the few people who speak Arabic in the special forces, the Arabic people in CIA, and sent them off to Iraq. So we leave Iraq alone. Iraq is a bad guy, Saddam is a bad guy, but he's been a bad guy for 20 years, and he wasn't about to do anything different. So I would say leave Iraq alone. Go from war on terrorism to a global war on nuclear terrorism in which we sign up all the other leaders, starting with Putin. The president would have to say, this is really important, have to talk to them about whether they agree. But I think if you sit down and look at the facts, nuclear terrorism is a threat to Moscow, because if Chechens, the guys who Russians are killing in Chechnya, get a nuclear weapon, Moscow is their target first, not New York, okay, or Boston. Now, if they got a half dozen weapons, maybe they sell one to al-Qaeda too. But in any case, Putin's interests are not different than American interests in losing nuclear weapons. So he had to have gone from war on terrorism to a war to deny terrorists access to any nuclear weapons and any nuclear material from which they can make a nuclear weapon. And I think if he had done that, you would have been able to round up the world. Now, I would say now, even with all the stuff in Iraq, whatever that, I would say if the president got up tomorrow and said, you know, I've just been thinking about this. This is the most important challenge America faces. We can't live in a world where there's blowing up American cities with nuclear weapons. That's not America. So we're going to do this, and we're going to sign it up today. I would go and be happy to work.
The reason you're on point, you know this Pakistani guy who was selling all this nuclear...
A.Q. Khan,
A.Q.
yes.
Khan. He had a hell of a good business going on.
You bet.
North Korea's got a little bit of business. The most dangerous country, in my opinion, is Iran. They are even more than North Korea because they're more sophisticated, I believe. And Iran also is committed to the destruction of Israel, period, wipe out.
And they're not friendly to the U.S. either.
And we're not, that's right, they're not for the United States. We had a fellow, I don't remember his name, who wrote a book about this and said, you know, you can't capture a state and eliminate terrorism because they're like amoebas, they fly all around. So they change countries. So therefore, going in and trying to, let's say Saddam Hussein, take him out and think you're going to eliminate terrorism, logically doesn't come to place. I mean, there may have been other reasons, maybe for the benefit of the Middle East, maybe Syria was contained, Iran was contained. I don't know. I don't want to be that critical of it. We spoke about it the other day, and the short answer, you know, why did he go in there? You know, somebody said his father, somebody said oil, somebody. You know, I think Bush is pure. I think it's just a judgment. You know, he made this judgment, and he was moved by guys like Wolfowitz, who I'm sure you know, and Cheney and Pearl, and they thought that this could be a strategic strike. I don't know. I don't know the answer. And maybe you do, but I just don't know.
No, I mean, what were the combination of factors? Because I don't think there was a single reason that led to this process. Who knows? But I would say what we do know now, and as we look at the evidence, is that this was a strategic error, a big strategic error, because just as you said, and I agree completely, we can't eliminate every terrorist everywhere, though we need to work at the problem, especially the masterminds. But what we can do is prevent terrorists getting nuclear weapons and nuclear material. Now that doesn't, well, if they don't have a nuclear bomb, they can't blow up an American city. That doesn't mean they can't shoot me. That don't mean that they can't have a suicide bomber go into a shopping center. Those are horrible things. But you have to think this hierarchy of horribles. If you say, well, geez, this terrible thing happened, but then somebody says, but holy Moses, well, how much worse could it be? The destruction of an American city by a terrorist nuclear weapon will change the face of America, and I think that,
and the world.
And the world. And that is preventable. That is, there's only a finite amount of this stuff. We can lock it up. Making new stuff is hard to do. We can prevent people from doing it. Are we doing that? No, we're not. And I agree with you. If you said, who's the most dangerous? Well, the problem is you got 3 or 4. And you have to we can't just do one thing. North Korea is very dangerous because they sell whatever they make to anybody, and they're making more nuclear weapons today, and we're not doing anything about it. Iran. Super dangerous, because they're sneaking across the line, and they're just about there to where they'll have a nuclear weapons program infrastructure where they can make uranium and reprocess plutonium. And once they're across that line, we know they have the A-team of terrorism. Hezbollah is much more professional than Al-Qaeda. And Pakistan, here's this guy, A.Q. Khan, the world's chief global black marketeer.
Right.
He's still living in his house. And the Pakistani government still says this was a rogue operation in which only 2 or 3 people were involved. Well, anybody who believes that, we should sell them a bridge.
Did you ever talk to Kissinger about this?
I have talked to Kissinger about this.
What were his feelings?
Well, he's interested in the topic, and we had to talk about it actually at a meeting we were both at in Warsaw, Poland in May. And I have sent him a copy of my book, and he asked me to come see him to talk to him about it. I haven't got there yet.
All right, we're going to close for this hour. We're going to come back next week and bring Graham back and talk about nuclear terrorism and continue this very, very vital conversation. And what you really are learning here, and I think it's important for the public to know, is that no matter who wins this election, whether it be John Kerry or George Bush, this is the problem. This is the world. Not only, as Graham said, do you destroy a city. Once you destroy a city, you destroy infrastructure of everything, banking, relationships, everything goes down. Like 9/11, it was contained only to 2 or 3 buildings, but it stopped financial markets. The world becomes a catastrophe. And unless we wake up to that fact, then we're really either in the hands of God or some super president we don't know about today. In any case, we will see you next week. And don't forget, it's part 2 of Graham Allison's great book on nuclear terrorism. We'll see you next week.
In modern Middle East history, only one peace treaty has stood the test of time, the 1978 Camp David Accord. In the new documentary film, Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace, learn the true story behind the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time and its lessons for the future.
The price of peace is very high. To have this courageous man and my close men killed.
Winner of the Telly Award for Best Cultural Program. Now available at select stores including Barnes & Noble and online at Amazon.com. Now get the book the hit movie was based on, Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels. Learn about the backdoor channel negotiations that led to the historic 1978 Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Become a witness to history and order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Also available at all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at iTunes or Audible.com. Relive history. Order Backdoor Channels. Get best-selling author Leon Charney's latest book, The Battle of the Two Talmuds. Join Charney as he explores years of Jewish history to find out why and how Talmudic scholars and rabbis abandoned the Holy Land for the lands of the diaspora. Learn about the power struggles behind the creation of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. It's a book critics call engaging and enlightening. A book which will be of interest to people of every faith. Now available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or download the audiobook of The Battle of the Two Talmuds at iTunes or Audible.com. Leon Charney sets out to discover the true meaning of the Kaddish, the Jewish custom of reciting a prayer to commemorate the death of a close relative. Join Charney as he finds out the history of the Kaddish and how it has evolved. Reviewed as a refreshing walk through Jewish history and a book that deserves to be read by both Jews and non-Jews, The Mystery of the Kaddish is now available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at Audible.com or on iTunes. Discover the Mystery of the Kaddish. Available now over iTunes, Amazon, and Google Play. Leon Charney's cantorial CD and Disco Lam. Listen as Charney movingly sings El Moleh Rachamim and Charney's amazing rendition of a disco remix of Adon Olam, all sung in the incredible and individual Charney style. Also listen to the CDs on Rhapsody. Download Leon Charney's cantorial songs and Disco Lam, the disco remix of Adon Olam on Amazon, iTunes, and Google Play. Or listen in on Rhapsody. All available now.
Bye.